Welcome to the Dawlish T Wall, a model of the railway along the sea wall at Dawlish, southwest England, in a scale of 1 to 450. I've now built the base for the railway. It took a lot more effort than I expected. In my last video I showed my detailed plans for the baseboard frame and had found that ordering custom cut wood online worked well. I was particularly pleased that I wouldn't have to cut much wood myself, because I'd typically had awful results with that in the past. At about the time I published that video, I found the company I'd used, Woodshop Direct, were closing down permanently, so I wasn't able to get a second order with them. Any other options I found online with custom cut sizes were far too expensive, so I'd be back to cutting wood myself after all. I had a look at what softwood strips were available from B&Q and settled on 1.8 metre lengths of 44 by 18 mm. I then tweaked my plan to accommodate the new dimensions and calculated how many strips I'd need, plus a spare to allow for inevitable errors. The delivery charge was reasonable, and I was able to select a delivery date on which I knew I could be at home, so at least I didn't lose any time fetching the wood. But I might have been better off fetching it myself. I noticed after signing for the delivery that one of the strips was ridiculously bent, rendering it mostly useless. I considered buying some kind of bench-mounted circular saw, but a knowledgeable carpenter I occasionally see told me that a cheaper and safer solution for my wood-cutting incompetence would be a mitre block and tenon saw. He was totally right. I was pleased and amazed at how much more accurately I could cut wood with the right tools. The mitre block I chose came with clamps, which looked like a useful feature, but they're flimsy and I soon found they're not fit for purpose, so I just used my other clamps. I noticed that the end of my tape measure has become loose. I checked the rest of it against a ruler. The actual measurements on the yellow part are still correct, but when hooked onto the end of something the result is most of a millimetre too long, so I had to factor that in for the longer measurements. Happily, I already had a decent 60 cm metal ruler, which was long enough for most of the lengths of wood in my plan. A few months ago I'd bought some squares to help with putting the frame together correctly, and they proved very useful. I wouldn't have stood a chance at getting the frame screwed together accurately without them. I realised that I'd also need a reliably flat surface. The only viable option was a kitchen surface. Not only is it flat, but I needed space at the sides to use my drill. By the time I had the outer frame and a couple of internal bracing pieces together, the whole thing felt fairly rigid. It took 2.5 hours to get to this point. It felt like very slow progress, but I was taking a lot of care to align things as accurately as I could. Sadly, despite all that effort, the frame didn't end up entirely square. It had a wobble to it. My cuts were typically within a millimetre of where they should be, and the corner clamps had resulted in right angles, so I suspect the wood isn't quite straight, particularly given how awful the spare one was. I decided this was the best I'd be able to do, so I carried on adding internal framing. I'd recently bought a right-angle ratchet screwdriver for working in tight spaces, and this proved very useful. The extra power from the leverage is surprisingly effective. With a normal screwdriver I'd be pushing hard, making my palm sore, but even using only a small amount of leverage made the going much easier. To get all of the internal framing screwed together meant turning things around in all sorts of angles and positions to have space for my drill, and I also had to take apart previous bits to have enough space to drill into the next bits. The whole process was extremely slow, and I also had to clear up to give the family use of the kitchen surfaces, then get things out again. I had the longer frame mostly completed after most of 2 days, and on the third day started on the shorter frame. I made sure that right from the beginning it would square up to the first frame, to ensure I could eventually get a proper join between the two baseboards. My kitchen surface isn't long enough for the whole railway, so I had to improvise a bit. It didn't take as long to get the lower level of the second baseboard together, and it had reasonable rigidity. This day the family needed more frequent use of the kitchen, so I had to find an alternative flat surface to make use of the free time I had to progress construction. This is the base that served as my end-gauge railway for several years, briefly seeing use for railway modelling once again. Yet again I found that the wood wasn't completely straight. I'm pretty certain the frame was flat this time, as different pieces of wood wobbled a different amount. I chose the one with the least wobble and shaved a bit off the frame so that everything could fit together tightly. It was a tight space to be working in, but I just about managed to make a start on the upper level of this frame, but that was the end of large chunks of progress. From here on I mostly only had scraps of free time over the following 2 weeks. I had, however, become fed up enough with the slow pace of progress to invest in an electric screwdriver. It was relative luxury to be able to get a screw into a pilot hole in a matter of seconds after drilling it. It had previously been minutes. Without a perfectly level frame, it was more difficult to get accurate alignment of other pieces. Here, the frame is upside down because I need its top to be level for the track, so that's the part against the level kitchen surface. But more important is having the cross beam flush with the frame, so in this case, and a few others, I had to strategically pack it with some cardboard to give it the right alignment. Once the bulk of the second baseboard had been made, I added metal alignment dowels, being careful to avoid existing screws. I was a bit of a numpty with the first attempt. I drilled straight through, so the dowel had nothing to brace it. On subsequent attempts, I found other ways to be a numpty. The first was that I'd somehow changed the drill to reverse without realising, and wondered why I had to push so hard to make progress. The other, which I didn't find out about until talking to a friend on another day, was that I was using drill bits that are from masonry rather than wood. Nevertheless, I eventually got the two male dowels in place. To get the exact position for the female ones, I lined up what will be the front of the railway and clamped the two sections together. Because the frame is softwood, the male dowels made a small pilot hole where the female pieces needed to go. I used a spade bit to start drilling those holes, even though it was slightly too narrow, because the pointy middle of the bit made sure that the hole was in exactly the right place. I've never been able to get a normal bit to drill exactly where I intend. I then enlarged the holes with the masonry bit. I was very pleased to find that the boards joined up beautifully using the alignment dowels. Getting the larger plywood top in place was straightforward, and whilst still relatively slow, it was a lot quicker than the frame pieces were. It felt as though it had enough bracing, and altogether it now felt like I had a proper piece of baseboard. Note that the plywood top isn't as long as the baseboard because when I ordered it I was planning on each base section being 1 metre long, but later changed my mind so the join would happen at a particular scenic feature that would help to disguise it. To fasten the alignment dowels in place I put a dollop of wood glue in the hole. The alignment dowels aren't threaded. They have recesses that I assume are for gripping glue. The female ones seem to be tightly in place, so I left those as they were. I can always add glue in the future if they happen to fall out. Having changed my mind about where the baseboards join, I needed to shorten the other section of plywood and slightly reprofile the curve on it. In an attempt to help guide the sawing, I scored the cut lines with a Stanley knife. This saw seemed like my best option for trimming the curve, but it was quite prone to buckling and it took a while to get the cut done. In trying to find this saw, I rediscovered a big file that I'd had for many years. That proved to be just right for tidying up the cut. On another day, for the straight cut, I opted for the tenon saw. That seemed to go through the plywood quite nicely, though I ended up a couple of millimetres off course quite quickly, which I'd hoped wouldn't happen with the score line from the Stanley knife. That was because there wasn't a score line. This was the wrong line. It was one I'd drawn months ago to help get the wavy curve in the right place. Rushing to get a bit of progress in a scrap of time now made more work to put it right. I later did the cut in the right place, and the score line did help. Placing the plywood pieces loose on the frame, it was clear that more bracing would be needed for the small bits. The next day I had several hours of free time and the house to myself. What luxury! So I took over the living room again, where there's plenty of space. By this point I had most of the pieces from my plan in place, and it was a case of adding bracing where it seemed necessary, but I didn't have much spare wood to work with. I mostly used leftovers from the N-gauge railway frame, but that was 46mm high, so I had to cut notches in some places. It was also getting difficult to get access to screw pieces on without lots of disassembly. One thing I tried was some small metal corner brackets, but these didn't work very well. The position of the screw hole and the screw has to be absolute, because as the screw tightens it pulls the bracket off course. That resulted in lifting this piece of wood too high, so I replaced the bracket with a screw at an angle. That doesn't look very strong to me, but this piece is there to take vertical load, so it should be okay. Where I'd made the wrong cut in the plywood, I needed to put an extra piece of bracing at the joint, and spend more time getting the pieces aligned, but ultimately it worked out okay without having to buy replacement plywood. As with the first piece, getting the remaining bits of plywood screwed on was relatively quick and easy. So, it took a lot of my available time over 3 weeks, but I now have the baseboards complete for the Dawlish T Wall. They'll be in and out of the railway room a lot as I gradually construct the rest of the model, and they feel strong enough to withstand that. There are obvious gaps here between plywood pieces. That's basically from the width of the jigsaw blade and a bit removed by filing and sanding when I first cut the curve. Ultimately, all of this base will be covered, so it won't matter. To hold the two sections together, I've bought some simple wing nut bolts, but I won't be trying to slide this around as one unit because I don't think the wood at the ends is strong enough to take that strain. These will just hold things together firmly when I eventually work on track and scenery that goes over the join. Coincidentally, during the weeks when I was working on all this, I had a trip to Dawlish with the family. It was a lovely full sunshine spring day, which was both pleasant and gave me an opportunity to take lots of useful photos. That's all for now. Bye bye.